While everyone was watching the Middle East, while sanctions were being drafted against Moscow, while Washington was reassuring NATO allies about resolve and containment, Russia was already inside the American sphere of influence, not with missiles, not with invasion fleets, with something far more effective, a functioning strategy that nobody in the capital wanted to acknowledge. Venezuela didn't fall to Russia because Russia is stronger. Venezuela fell to Russia because America stopped understanding how power actually works. This matters not because Venezuela is important to you personally, but because it's a template, a proof of concept. And the systems that failed there, they're still failing now. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Jonathan Fink. The mainstream story is straightforward, almost simple. After Hugo Chavez died in 2013, Venezuela collapsed, the economy imploded, oil production fell, hyperinflation destroyed the currency, millions fled. Nicolas Maduro, the successor, is corrupt and authoritarian. Washington imposed sanctions. Russia opportunistically provided military advisors and kept Maduro in power. End of story. That's what we're told. And like most narratives built for public consumption, it's correct about the facts, but wrong about the mechanism. Here's where we need to step back. The sanctions they were aggressive. By 2017, the United States had frozen Venezuelan assets abroad, blocked debt restructuring, and isolated the government financially. By every metric of coercive power, America should have won. Maduro should have fallen. The regime should have collapsed under its own weight. It didn't. And that failure wasn't accidental, it was structural. Let's be clear about what this actually means. The United States has maintained the most comprehensive sanctions regime against Venezuela in modern history. The pressure has been consistent, bipartisan, and deliberate. And yet somehow Russia, operating from thousands of miles away with a fraction of America's economic leverage, managed to keep the government stable. The real question isn't why Russia succeeded, it's why America failed at something it should have excelled at. The answer requires understanding a basic principle of geopolitical power that Washington lost sight of somewhere between the Cold War and the War on Terror. Sanctions only work if there's somewhere else to turn. Isolation only works if isolation is actually possible. Russia made Venezuela impossible to isolate, not through military force, through presence, through alternatives, through the simple and devastating act of showing up when American banks wouldn't deal with Venezuela. Russian banks would. When Western refineries wouldn't process Venezuelan oil, Russian refineries would. When the international financial system was closed to Caracas, Moscow opened a parallel door. These weren't grand gestures. They were mechanical, deliberate, unglamorous. This is where the narrative collapses. America assumed that economic pressure plus diplomatic isolation would equal regime change. Russia assumed that American isolation would be incomplete and acted accordingly. One assumption was based on how the world used to work. The other was based on how it actually works now. Venezuela became a case study in something that doesn't have a good name in policy circles, but it should. Let's call it strategic counterweight. Here's how it functioned. The United States applied maximum pressure through every legitimate channel of power available to it: sanctions, asset freezes, international isolation, diplomatic pressure on allies, every tool in the coercive toolbox, and none of it worked because Russia had already established itself as a reliable alternative to American power. Think about the incentive structure from Maduro's perspective. If he capitulates to American pressure, his government falls and he loses everything. If he holds out and maintains the relationship with Moscow, he survives. The mathematics of that decision are brutal, but they're clear. Russia wasn't offering him a path to prosperity. Russia was offering him a path to survival. That's often enough. But this goes deeper than just keeping one unpopular government in place. The real mechanism was about something Washington has struggled to grasp since the Soviet Union fell. The world actually does contain multiple centers of power, and when one center applies pressure, the others don't have to follow the script. Russia moved into Venezuela because America left space for it to move into, not through absent-mindedness, but through something more structural. The United States had convinced itself that economic power was the primary form of power, that sanctions and market access were tools that could, over time, reshape entire societies, that isolation was a weapon that always worked if you just applied it long enough. This is where things get uncomfortable, because this belief isn't unique to Venezuela. It animated policy toward Iran. It shaped approaches to China and North Korea. It was the entire strategic premise of the post-Cold War order. The world economy was integrating, and those who didn't accept American terms would be left behind. Eventually they would submit because the cost of not submitting would become unbearable. Russia didn't believe that story. Russia understood something simpler. If the cost of submission is higher than the cost of resistance, people will resist. And if you provide an alternative to submission, even a painful alternative, even an imperfect one, people will choose it. Here's what makes Venezuela particularly instructive. The American sanctions regime against Venezuela has been catastrophically effective at one thing: destroying the lives of ordinary people. Over 4 million Venezuelans fled the country. Malnutrition spread, infrastructure collapsed. By every humanitarian measure, the sanctions were brutal. They didn't remove Maduro. The people most impacted by the sanctions, the poor, the displaced, the desperate, had no capacity to overthrow the government. They had no capacity to do anything except suffer and leave. The government, meanwhile, could insulate itself through smuggling networks, Russian support, and control of the security forces. This is the hidden cost that policy discussions never quite address. Sanctions don't necessarily remove dictators. Often they simply make life unbearable for everyone except the dictator. And Venezuela proved something else that Washington still hasn't fully absorbed. Isolation doesn't actually work anymore, not the way it once did. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union was genuinely cut off from the Western economy. Trade was minimal, capital flows were blocked, integration was impossible. The Iron Curtain wasn't a metaphor, it was a functional reality. Venezuela doesn't exist in that world. The world is network. Commodities move through multiple channels. Technology spreads through multiple sources. Sanctions create friction, but they don't create walls. Not anymore. What Venezuela actually revealed was a shift in the structure of global power that the United States didn't want to acknowledge. For 3 decades after the Cold War, America operated from a position of assumed inevitability. Allies were allies because the alternative was unthinkable. Economic integration meant political alignment. Military superiority meant strategic dominance. Venezuela showed what happens when those assumptions meet reality. When a government faces a choice between American pressure and Russian support, and those are the actual options on the table, the outcome is determined by which option preserves power, not ideologically, not morally, mechanically. Russia understood this. That's why the presence in Venezuela wasn't about grandeur or ideology. It was about positioning. Military advisors who trained security forces, refineries that processed oil when no one else would, credit lines that kept the government functioning when international finance cut it off. These weren't world-changing gestures, they were sufficient gestures. This is where the real danger emerges. Not that Russia is trying to spread communism or expand empire, though those narratives persist. The real danger is that Russia had accurately identified a gap in American power, the gap between pressure and alternatives, and filled it simply, effectively, scalably. And here's the part no one wants to address. Venezuela wasn't an anomaly. It was a template because the conditions that made the Russian intervention successful in Venezuela exist in multiple places simultaneously. Governments under American pressure, populations searching for alternatives, economic systems that don't have to completely integrate into Western markets to survive. The response from Washington was interesting. It wasn't strategic adjustment or recognition that the coercive model wasn't working. Instead, it was intensification, more sanctions, stronger isolation, threats against third parties dealing with Venezuela, a doubling down on the assumption that if pressure just increases, compliance must eventually follow. This is the trap. This is the trap. This is where doctrine becomes dangerous because each additional sanction, each additional threat actually strengthens the case for countries to build alternative relationships. Why would any government cooperate with American demands if cooperation doesn't preserve power and non-cooperation does? The question isn't whether Russia has defeated America in Venezuela. The question is whether America is willing to acknowledge that the tools it's been using don't work the way it assumed they would. That assumption animated policy across 3 continents. If it's wrong in Venezuela, it's wrong everywhere. And if it's wrong everywhere, then the entire post-Cold War security architecture is built on a foundation that doesn't hold weight anymore. Venezuela didn't fall to a Russian invasion or a Chinese conspiracy or some grand ideological campaign. Venezuela became a Russian asset through the simple mechanism of American abandonment, not of the country, but of strategy. The United States applied pressure without alternatives, issued demands without incentives, and created a vacuum that something else had to fill. This isn't a warning about what will happen. This is the recognition of what has already happened. The mechanism is established. The template exists. The question is whether the systems that created this outcome will acknowledge it or simply repeat it somewhere else. This isn't the end of the story, but it may be the end of the illusion that coercion alone determines outcomes in a multipolar world. Thank you for watching.